Friends, this is a continuation of our discussion on postmodernism and international relations theory. In the last lecture, we had a kind of conceptual setting. Actually, it was not a conceptual setting, it was only a kind of a general understanding of the important categories or concepts which postmodernists discuss, like discourse, deconstruction, biopolitics, etc., etc. So what we are trying to do today is a kind of understanding of postmodernism from a disciplinary perspective, international relations disciplinary perspective. Before we attempt to do that, let us have a broad understanding of what postmodernism is in general, or what scholars or intellectuals within this tradition talk about. So, postmodernism has been criticized, it has been glorified, it has been critiqued from a kind of a disciplinary point of view, from a very layman's point of view, and things like that. Some of the concerns raised by postmodernists are also part of what we call as various movements across the world. People have a tendency to associate several movements, particularly at the micro level, at the local level. They associate these movements with the intellectual traditions of postmodernism or post-structuralism in that sense. When we discuss this trend in social sciences and humanities, this trend is not exclusive of a particular discipline, rather it transcends disciplinary boundaries. But what is important today, at least during the last 20-25 years of our recent contemporary history, postmodernism has been understood even within the framework of what we call as neoliberal experiments or neoliberal ideological positions, and how civil society has been given a kind of a new space in the development process and things like that. So postmodernism has been taken to that level by some scholars, and they even critique postmodernism as part of a kind of a cultural logic of neoliberalism. I'm just using it as a kind of metaphor. I think the actual phrase, or you may say that that usage was from a scholar called Frederick Jameson, who way back in early 1970s called postmodernism as a cultural logic of late capitalism. So there are attempts to interpret postmodernism from that angle, how development process, the contemporary period, can be critiqued or understood from that point of view, and like that. So let me come to certain basic problems that we encounter in the analysis of postmodernism. Actually, what we are trying to do is kind of exploring the political possibilities of postmodernism, or you may call it as politics of postmodernism. And some scholars would say that postmodernism has been very useful in cultural studies and literature, in various such what we call as non-social science disciplines, like maybe in literary criticism and so on and so forth, but not of great importance for social sciences and things like that. So let us examine the implications of this intellectual trend. I'd be more comfortable to use this word intellectual trend of postmodernism rather than seeing it as a single theory of postmodernism. You have several traditions within postmodernism and poststructuralism, and you may not be able to appropriate one tradition or the other for the sake of generalizing things. So we find that a group of scholars even started valorizing or glorifying postmodernism from the point of view of a kind of grassroots politics, micro level politics, or local level development and things like that. So even alternative politics is also understood from the point of view of the end result of a kind of a postmodern thinking and like that. And there are such attempts in that way. But basically, what we see in postmodernism is a kind of the fundamental, or you may say the essential aspect of postmodern trend is its critique of modernity, and its critique of all kinds of claims of modernity, which we call as from the point of view of grand narratives, which we discussed yesterday, grand narratives of the past. So within the postmodern, what we call language or lexicon, and several concepts like development, progress, global, universal, these terms have new meanings, perhaps no meaning at all. So that's why that we say that the postmodern paradox of the what we call as the phenomenon of the global environment is so complex. So let us have a kind of a general understanding of its intellectual origin. But it's very difficult to precisely offer a definition of what postmodernism is. It eludes a kind of a neat definition in that sense, a neat conceptualization, because it appears in a wide variety of disciplines, from art, architecture, literature to anthropology, history, political science, international relations, and like that. So it may not be accurate, it may not be appropriate to offer a definition from a disciplinary point of view at this stage, because it transcends disciplinary boundaries. So since it is difficult to say exactly what it is, how we can define it, it is also difficult to say when exactly it began, its intellectual origins and like that. But we can safely locate it in the history of critiquing of modernity. Actually, that started with modernity itself. From that point of view, you can trace these intellectual origins to some of the critiques of modernity, which started in the 19th century or even the early 20th century itself. Even the writings of Nietzsche, even the early writings of some scholars, some intellectuals in the 20th century, you can find the beginnings of the critique of modernity from that point of view. And you know that some scholars had even would call this trend postmodernism as a kind of a conservative reaction within modernism itself. Some critics argued like that. You find that it has been used in a variety of ways in different disciplines, and some scholars would try to call it as a historical period, a historical epoch, or in literature, in cultural studies, we can find an explanation from the point of view of or a definition or a conceptualization of postmodernism from the point of view of aesthetic mode. And differently, you find that some scholars would call it as a change in the condition of knowledge. And some scholars would associate postmodernism with the various discourses and movements and things like that. Anyway, what I'm saying is that this word postmodern or postmodernity or postmodernism has been used differently by different scholars. If you examine the writings of the historian of the 20th century, Arnold Toynbee, you will find that a Marxist sociologist like C. Wright Mills and many others discussed postmodernism from that point of view. But no, it's not those writings or those conceptualizations were not in the way that the postmodernists since at least from 1960s have been used. That's a totally different uh, conceptual understanding or what we call conceptual dealing or engaging of postmodern and things like that. But it was actually from the 1960s that the concept of postmodernism gained a lot of attention, popularity across the world, primarily due to the writings or the intervention of scholars from France like Michel Foucault, Orang Derrida, and others, and a few others from the American literary traditions. Uh, and also, what triggered this trend, what prompted scholars uh, to catch up with these trends was the increasing tempo, the pace of civil rights movements in the 1960s, the popularity of counterculture, the popularity of, or you may say, the increasing acceptance of feminist writings. More than that, you have the environmental movements, the anti-war movements, the anti-nuclear movements, alternative development perspectives, and more so, you have the pace of decolonization and all these things all contributed to this sort of a thinking that the trends underway since 1960s across the world, particularly in Europe and United States and other countries, all led to this sort of thinking that the world has entered into a new phase, a new era, which could appropriately called postmodern, according to these scholars. Uh, you see, most of these scholars or writings of postmodernism, they start with an analysis of the implications of modernism or modernity. Uh, or you may call that their critique of modernity was the beginning of all these things. And some scholars would say that, when debating on these issues of modernity, some scholars would say that the world has entered a stage of the death of modernism, death of modernity, and others would say that a counter modernity has come into being and things like that. So these scholars say that uh, the modern is, if it is generally associated with the Enlightenment, actually Enlightenment began during the 18th century. But some would say that the trace, uh, they would trace the elements of Enlightenment thought back to the Renaissance period or even earlier. They said that their critique is basically of the whole process of what we call as a Renaissance or Enlightenment and so on and so forth. So their arguments may have been uh, very contentious, but the implications of modernity as the Enlightenment were not disputed, and as exemplified through reason, rationality, science, positivism, democracy, secularism, rule of law, and most importantly, through the expanding capitalist enterprise. And I must say that by the middle of the 20th century, uh, you have heard about uh, certain phrases like the crisis of modernity, failure of modernity, end of modernity. These were the recurrent themes of various discourses. And this had eventually led to postmodern thinking and perspectives from a wide range of angles. And Habermas, for example, who belonged to the Frankfurt School of Critical Theories, he responded to the debates on postmodernity in a different way, saying that postmodernism actually represented a conservative response to the limits and the inadequacies of the project of modernity. Rather, he would prefer this term, the end of enlightenment, uh, for the sort of crisis of modernity. But he said that postmodernism actually reflected a movement beyond the horizon of traditional reason, in which European modernity once tried to understand itself. So Habermas certainly agrees with postmodernists in their analysis of the limitations of modernity, but he refuses to agree with the view that the project of modernity as such should be given up. So since the 1970s, postmodern writings and theories proliferated across various disciplines, and this was uh, enriched by some prominent French intellectuals such as Michel Foucault, Rang Derrida, Barthes, Deleuze, Baudrillard, and Guattari, and several others. Uh, Interestingly, the major text of these writers, as Barry Smart pointed out, uh, could appropriately seen as analysis of modernism or modernity. And many of these intellectuals which I just mentioned, they never claimed themselves as postmodernists or post-structuralists in that way. For example, though Foucault is critical of the notion of postmodernism, his writings were generally seen as, particularly in the United States, as distinct contributions to an analysis of postmodernism or postmodernity. Uh, but his analysis of the forms of knowledge and relations of power, that actually triggered a wave of postmodern temper across the intellectual landscape. Perhaps the most important contribution in that way came from a scholar, a French scholar, who was commissioned by the Quebec government there to write on the report on knowledge. That's it. And Rang Francois Lothier, he came out with his book in 1970s, particularly in the late 1970s, which appeared with this title, The Postmodern Condition, a report on knowledge, which came out in 1970s. This work, Lyotard's The Postmodern Condition, generated debates and responses on postmodernity and on postmodernism also. Actually, according to uh, Lyotard, uh, the concept of postmodern designates the state of our culture following the transformations which, since the end of the 19th century, have altered the game rules of or game rules for science, literature, and arts. Lyotard says that postmodern condition of knowledge is the result of a complex process of socio-cultural and economic development, the prime concerns of which are the development of post-industrial techniques and technologies, the regeneration of capitalist mode of production, and the seeds of delegitimation and nihilism that were inherent in the grand narratives of the 19th century. So Lyotard says that the status of knowledge is altered as societies enter what is known as the post-industrial age, and cultures enter what is known as the postmodern age. Here, Lyotard seems to agree with Daniel Bell's notion of post-industrial society in characterizing the transformation in the political economy of Western societies. The transformation of the what we call as of the political economy of the Western societies, particularly the advances in information and telecommunication technologies, and of course related changes in culture and society. For Daniel Bell, post-industrial society means changes in the realm of production following developments in science and technology. The major changes Daniel Bell identified are a relative shift of emphasis from goods production to service provision in the economic sector, and an increasing what we call as emphasis in health, education, research and development, government agencies in particular, and growth in numbers and influence of professional and technical class. primacy of theoretical knowledge as a resource for innovation and policy, control of technology and technological assessment, and the creation of a new intellectual technology. So this is what Daniel Bell talks about the post-industrial age, or the characterizing post-industrial age. So this, while industrial society is revolving around the coordination of workers and machines for the production of goods, post-industrial society has been organized around knowledge for the purpose of social control and directing of innovation and change. So in that way, uh, post-industrial society suggests the possibility of a decentralization of work and industrial structures, besides an increase in the quantity of knowledge and information. So these changes have emerged in the context of an increasing privatization and commercialization of social life and commodification of knowledge and information. So these have been accelerated by transnational corporate capitalism operating in the international market. So in that sense, the concept elucidated through the categories like neo-Fordism or flexible accumulation are very important, and they are seen as a response to the crisis of corporate capitalism and the related socio-political problems following the decline of the post-war Fordist Keynesian model of development. So, though the post-industrial capitalism generates new forms of diversity, plurality, and creativity, they are increasingly vulnerable to commodification and commercialization. And these observations are very important from the point of view of understanding the cultural logic of what we call as capitalism, world capitalism. And it is here that Lyotard also seems to have derived a lot of insights from the concept developed by Ernest Mantle on late capitalism and things like that. He maintains that post-industrial technological changes have affected not only scientific research, but the way in which learning is acquired, classified, and made available and exploited. So in short, with the increasing commodification and commercialization of knowledge, research is more or less tuned to the needs of clients, and knowledge itself is generated in order to be sold, produced for its exchange value. So inevitably, in postmodern societies, educational policies put emphasis on system performance, skills and training rather than on vague humanist ideals or values of education. So Lyotard further argues that totality, stability, and order, etc., are all maintained in modern societies through the means of what he called as grand narratives, or meta-narratives, or master narratives. These are the terms which he uses so frequently in his work. So here, postmodernism becomes a critique of grand narratives, maintaining that such narratives tend to uh, conceal the inherent contradictions and instabilities that are prevailing in any social organization or practice. So, arguing that the modern uh, promise of universal emancipation is no longer sustainable, no longer feasible, Lyotard pointed out that it is difficult to establish an association of increases in rationality of developments in the arts, the science and technology with the progress, with increasing freedom and happiness for humanity. So by rejecting all grand or meta narratives, postmodernists they champion actually mini narratives, local narratives, which would glorify small practices and local events rather than large scale, universal or global concepts. So such mini narratives are typically local, situational, provisional, contingent, and temporary, advancing no claim to universality, no claim to truth, no claim to reason or stability and like that. Another scholar, you would have, perhaps Professor Frederick Jameson, he says that postmodernism has an ideological task also to coordinate new forms of practice and social and mental habits with new forms of economic production and organization thrown up by the late capitalism. And according to Frederick Jameson, postmodernism constitutes a cultural dominant accompanying the latest stage in the development of capitalist mode of production. Earlier, Ernest Mantel he had elaborated these stages of capitalist development, saying that the late capitalism represented the third since the Second World War. The first and second phases being market capitalism and monopoly capitalism. And Frederick Jameson, following Mantel, outlined three significant stages of capitalism which dictated particular cultural formations, which are realism, modernism, and postmodernism. So, while conceptualizing the cultural logic of capitalism, late capitalism, Jameson noted that instead of denouncing the complexities of postmodernism as some final symptoms of decadence, or welcoming the new forms as the harbingers of a new technological and technocratic utopia, it may be appropriate to assess the new cultural production within the working hypothesis of a general modification of culture itself within the social restructuration of late capitalism as a system. So there were similar attempts linking postmodernism with capitalism. For example, David Harvey he suggested that postmodernism is a cultural form associated with the more flexible modes of capital accumulation and a new space-time compression in the organization of capitalism that emerged in response to the crisis of the Fordist regime of capitalist accumulation. And Harvey agrees that postmodernism exercises a positive influence, but he elsewhere argues that it is dangerous because it avoids confronting the realities of political economy and the circumstances of global power. And David Harvey, he noted that the New Left, while sustaining the cultural practices and politics of postmodernism, has gone to the extent of giving up its faith both in the proletariat as an instrument of progressive change and in historical materialism as a mode of analysis. And it's quite natural that David Harvey and several others, for example, Samir Amin also criticized postmodernism from a wider angle, calling it postmodernism as a negative utopia, um, uh, expressing capitulation to the demands of capitalist political economy in its cultural phase, the hope of humanity is managing crisis and like that. So the expansion of the service sector, the increasing role for information technology, the commodity production of information and images, etc. There are significant developments in the present stage of capitalist development. So it is precisely for this reason that postmodernism is seen in association with post-industrialism and information society. So the emergence of post-industrial information economy actually replaced all concepts and categories. It also implies a nation state contested by new worldviews, ethnicity, religiosity, fundamentalism, revivalism, multiculturalism, environmentalism, etc. Old categories, old scientific categories and theories are in that sense reassessed, and modernist ideals of rationality and individualism are rejected. So postmodernism is in that sense an anti-enlightenment position wherein it believes that what has gone before is inappropriately dependent on reason, rationalism, wisdom, inherently elitist, hegemonic, and oppressive. So, accordingly, the project of emancipation and liberation is advanced from diverse positions, thereby championing new social movements and civil society engagements, etc. etc. So this is just another introductory lecture on postmodernism. We will come back with how it works, how it has been engaged by IR scholars, at least since 1980s onwards.